Okay. Um, Good morning, everyone. I want to go ahead and give you a little bit of, I guess, review, since this is a couple days before the final. Review of the Roaring Twenties. I don't really think that the DBQ is going to be over that, but it's probably best to be safe. I want to give you an overview of much of the rest of the 20s and the economic boom that occurred there. Um, on that note, keep in mind if you're worried that you don't feel as comfortable with this topic, the thing with this particular exam for this year is that it really all depends on the work that we've done writing. That's almost all of the work here. And so if you don't feel as confident in either, say from 1920, 1945, which almost certainly is not going to be the DBQ. I shouldn't say that. I just really don't think it is. Um, but just know that ultimately, if you have a general idea, you should be fine. If there's anything you really need help with, there's always Google. But mostly, this DBQ is all about the practice that we've put in with historical context, writing a thesis, SAPs. That's the majority of this, and that's what's going to get you through. So regardless of what the topic is, don't freak out if you feel like it's not a topic you're really well versed in. Um, Lean back on and rely on your writing techniques, right? All that work that we've done there. Um, I want to talk, right? We kind of did post World War One and the end of the Progressive Era last time. I mean, this still is post World War One. We're just kind of moving into the Roaring Twenties, and by Roaring Twenties, I mean the economic boom that occurred starting in the early 20s and extending through to the Great Depression and kind of ending with the Great Depression in 1929. So when we left off, we talked about the end of the Progressive Era. We had the passage of and ratification of two amendments, one being prohibition and the 18th Amendment, which was ironically, right, and kind of confusingly passed in 1919. And then the 20th Amendment, or the 19th Amendment, excuse me, passed in 1920. So we got prohibition and the women's suffrage passed. And we talked about that kind of culminating or kind of being seen as almost the peak of the Progressive Era, because after that, the social disconnect and the fear of communism and the kind of post-war recession kind of put a damper on progressive demands or the progressive movement. And we see Republicans kind of taking control and looking for return to normalcy. We mentioned that with Harding. We'll get to him towards the end of this. And some of those old problems kind of creeping up. Nativism, which had always been pretty much a part of United States history, as it is in a lot of ways, a lot of countries' histories. But, it kind of moved back. Nativism took a backseat to the fear of the South, right prior to the Civil and during the Civil War. And then it kind of creeps up gradually in through the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. But with after World War I and the fear of the Bolshevik Revolution and communism comes a fear of all immigrants, right? And the traditional fear of immigrants taking jobs and driving wages down. With this, without a war to keep people's focus on other things, in the 1920s, people started to see this post-war recession, right, as being made worse by immigrants. Not to mention they're bringing in and threatening American institutions with, ideas of socialism and communism, right? And just keep in mind that that is generally the perception of most, especially middle and upper class individuals. And keep in mind now that the middle class has a lot more authority politically. They have a lot more clout, right? You have women with the right to vote. So you get a lot of middle class women now going to the polls. I off the top of my head, I don't know voting percentages of lower class men and women, but I would imagine it I'm wondering it might be lower than what exists in the middle class. I have to check on that. I'm not sure, but you've got a lot of middle class, votes going to kind of the things that I just mentioned. Enforcing or calling for nativist legislation, preventing immigration, and then so there's a whole host of issues that come up alongside that. Um, Post-war recession, but then and that could continue on even into the booming parts of the economy. So here I have a list, right, of what we're going to go through today. Going to talk about the economic boom and all the parts of that. We're going to talk about social change and conflict, specifically women. We talk a little bit more about nativism and briefly the Ku Klux Klan and their kind of resurgence. And then we're going to talk about Harding and Coolidge. Now, with African Americans, because I have to go over them again. I think tomorrow I'm going to post a lecture going over some things because just by the way I've lectured, I did not include a couple things I really want you to know about. So we'll go over that and say kind of what's happening with African Americans at this time for tomorrow. So let's go through and talk about the economic boom. Interestingly, I think that's not too bad. It's just this is the only one that's off. So after that post-war depression or kind of recession, you enter into a period of economic boom, right? Where the economy seems to have adjusted to the fact that the military and the United States government is not buying as much. The industries adjust and actually counter and start to grow quite a bit again. And there's a couple of reasons for this. After that recession, you actually start to get demand and production start to increase because of the growing middle class. And so while not everyone's wages were rising and there was some difficulty and initially some problems with wages being stagnant, over the course of the 1920s, wages do begin to rise, especially for the middle class, and they're going to start spending money. With that money comes an increased demand for goods. So you see at the top of this cyclical chart, there's increased demand for goods. And don't forget also that with war-ravaged Europe, they are also buying a lot of American goods. So American corporations and industries are producing a lot, right? There's increased demand, so they're starting to produce quite a bit more, as you can see in that next box. So, right, increased production. Now, I didn't check this all that clearly. Increased production doesn't necessarily lead to increased sales, but the two are tied together, right? Increased sales leads to increased production, whatnot. And increased demand also leads to increased employment, and increased sales also leads to increased profits. Boy, I should have found a different. Next time I'm going to remove this document. I thought, evidently I didn't look through it carefully enough. But generally, increased profits comes from increased sales, and increased demand equals increased employment. And all of that then generally is going to lead to increasing purchasing power for people. So not just for, so think about that, right? If people are being hired, they're making more money than if they weren't, right? And so employment starts to, unemployment starts to decline. So more people are employed. They have money to spend, and so they buy things, right? That's increased demand, and so we start the cycle over. This is essentially what happens in the economic boom of the 20s, or generally with a lot of economic booms. And I want you to pay careful attention to this too, because if I get to it, there's another cycle that is essentially the reverse that we'll talk about with the Great Depression, which is essentially demand falls, companies and corporations cut back production, they lay off workers, which means workers go without pay, and so they stop buying. And as they stop buying, there's a further decrease in demand, which is going to cause more corporations to cut production, and the cycle is going to basically it's a reverse. It's an economic bust. So keep an eye for that for the Great Depression when we get to that. So just to make sure I covered, we got increased demand. We talked about that. We've also got new technology in just about every sector of the economy, making things more efficient to make. And if they're more efficient, then the industries can save money and lower prices. And if prices are lowered, more people are going to be able to buy those goods, which means increased demand, which means the cycle is up, right? We're continuing the cycle. So new technology making things more efficient is part of this boom. Again, I already mentioned increasing consumer spending. That's part of this cycle. You also have, moving on to the next kind of main ideas, is increased industry organization. And this is something that continues on from the Industrial Revolution, right, and has been going on in the United States for well over 100 years. But we saw a lot of new stuff in the Industrial Revolution with the way corporations organize their businesses by vertical and horizontal immigration, in terms of how they manage everything, right? This kind of thing continues. We've got new types of organizing industries that help to make these industries more efficient. And thus, if they're more efficient, they can reduce the cost of items and reduce prices, which is going to stimulate the economy, and people are going to want to buy and be able to buy new products that previously weren't available to them. So you've got, right, continued expansion of businesses, right, economies of scale. The larger they are, generally with a lot of industries, the less it costs per unit of whatever to produce. So economies of scale, industries growing bigger, also in an attempt to compete, outcompete or outbid or outprice their competitors. And so that's creating large corporations that are more efficient. You've also got the introduction of what's called welfare capitalism. This is, in short, welfare capitalism is when, kind of in response to labor demands, some large companies start to address the concerns of their laborers, of the unions. And so, for example, Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company is one of the most notable examples here. He shortened the work week to 5 days a week. He raised wages to basically make his auto workers some of the best paid in the nation, or in the world rather, and then offered things like paid vacation. Now, this doesn't necessarily address every concern by the laborers or by labor unions, but it does address a lot of them. And it may not get them exactly what they want, but it is in some ways it helps to take away the platform of the labor unions. Other companies would do things like offer retirement or pension systems, and these benefits differed for men and for women depending on what they were offering because of social views at the time. But generally speaking, this had the effect of reducing the power of labor unions. So not only did labor unions have to go up against increasingly powerful American companies who were pretty well invested in the government and had ties there, but also, labor unions had to fight against this prejudice that they were essentially socialist, chaotic disruptors. It was just, I think, generally the American public, especially the middle and upper class, viewed them as such. And so the unions kind of take a big hit here. And we see that if we look at union membership in 1920 compared to 1929. You go from about 5 million unionized workers in 1920, and that drops to about 3 million in 1929, which is a significant drop, right? That's what, 40% over the course of 10 years. So that kind of indicates to us the success of industry in kind of addressing the concerns and beating down unions. It's not just that corporations made unions irrelevant. It's not that. It's that they were good at politically attacking unions and depriving unions of at least some of their platform. Moving on here too, I want to talk about farming specifically. Henry Ford makes a kind of entrance here too, through basically improvements in farming techniques and technology. Right, so we talked about technology and industry. Well, farming is one of those industries. Right, you get the Model T, or rather, you get the Ford Motor Company, which was famous, right, for essentially mass producing the Model T, and using the assembly line to cut down costs of labor and production, and so that your average middle class individual could buy a Model T and transport and go around town. Well, this also helped. The Ford Motor Company also built tractors for farming. So your average and sometimes even middle to lower class farmers would be able to afford this new technology to increase their crop yield. You also, by the way, have new fertilizers available, right? So with kind of this continued scientific development, you've got new fertilizers, which of course is going to increase crop yields. Now, this all seems really good, and it is, because with increased crops, you've got increased supply. Prices are going to fall for your average consumer, right? That's good for the consumer. But when you got such what we might call overproduction, it's not always best for the farmer, because what that means, right, if you got an oversupply, if demand does not meet that supply, then prices are going to fall. Now, bigger farms are going to be able to handle this a little bit better. Economies of scale, they can handle that decrease in price. But your smaller farmers are going to really struggle with not getting the price that they wanted or need to sustain their farm. So you're going to start to see kind of a depression within farming communities, especially small, local, family-run farms. Again, this is pretty much typical of a lot of United States history, right? Farmers, right, have it bad. They're not going to get the subsidies that we kind of know today until the Great Depression. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is going to start pushing and making subsidies available for some of these farmers. And hopefully we'll be able to talk about that too. So we've got increased production. Demand does not really meet or stay with that, so prices are going to fall. It's tough for them. I don't mean to, it sounds like I was saying tough luck, but just to wrap up, it's tough for farmers. But I also want to talk about consumerism and new consumerism. We kind of saw this developing back in the market revolution of the 1820s. And right, this continues on through the Industrial Revolution and now into the 1920s. What you get, right, with the growth of the middle class, the growth of the economy and rising wages for a lot of individuals and the increase in standard of living, it's going to kind of create, right, it's going to allow people to have what's called discretionary spending, meaning money that they can spend on things that they don't really need, like, immediately to survive. So you get things like refrigerators and typewriters. Now, typewriters and refrigerators might be really, really useful for some businesses, but that's not really what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about consumer spending for your average individual, like to have a refrigerator at the home, or to have a typewriter at home, or maybe even for a small business. I should stay away from that because that's not really discretionary spending. But yeah, so for something that people don't necessarily need to survive, but something that makes them comfortable and adds to their quality of living, people in the United States have the money to buy things like this. Now, and that ability to buy and the fact that they go and buy these things puts money into the economy and stimulates the economy, increasing that cycle, that upward kind of momentum. So, right, rise in the middle class, more discretionary spending contributes to this booming economy, right? We've already mentioned the automobile. Don't forget Ford and the Model T. You got General Motors coming out, right, getting pretty darn big. And, you know, building all those cars is going to, right, require a lot of materials, and these companies are spending money buying on those materials. So you've got other industries benefiting as well. And then don't forget the radio and we'll talk about the effect of the radio on popular culture. But the automobile and the radio are probably two other really, really important products to know about when you're talking about consumer spending, because they also tend to change and affect the social atmosphere as well. Let's move in to talk about social change and conflict. We're going to talk mostly about women here. So what I want to mention specifically, we talked earlier, right, when men went off to war, when young men went off to war in World War I, women would often take their place in industry because industries still need to produce things, specifically for the war effort. So we remember women and African Americans. But when men come back, not all women, some women were displaced, right? They went back home, they either got married or right, went to be homemakers. But many women did in fact stay in that industry. And I think at this time you get about 25% of what was the quote? I had it here. I almost forgot. So yeah, of married women who worked outside the home in 1920, most of them were the working class. And so by that, what I mean is generally the middle and upper class, their wives of the middle class don't really have to work. And so still culturally, it's kind of expected that they don't. It's not entire, just because a lot more women are working doesn't mean culturally it is still accepted. Now you see a lot of working class women working because they have to in order to survive or keep their children fed. So husband works, wife works. That's mostly how it went there. The upper class women don't have to, so they're still more likely than not staying home. So you've got so a lot more women working. There's increased availability of college education, which had been growing over the 19th century and continues to grow in the 20th century. So women are increasingly educated. Now, just the sad part about that too is even though they're increasingly educated, it's still not necessarily as accepted for them to enter, especially the high, more respected professions such as doctors, lawyers, whatnot. There are several really prominent examples. But that's just it. They're more the exception than the rule. So women are breaking into those prestigious employment areas, but for the most part, there's still still a prejudice against them, and a social kind of perception that they should not be working. So that also is working against women at this time. But their progress is moving on, right? There are more of them working, and we'll see how this is changing society. One last thing here is that with this increased consumerism, right, with this increased wealth that a lot of middle and upper class families are seeing, what that does, as the husband tends to be working and focusing on work related items, it's the woman, it's the wife who then kind of as kind of homemaker who actually takes charge of a lot of the purchasing for items for the home. So interestingly, women have this new role of being able to handle the money that the husband makes. And so what we'll see is that advertising becomes really popular at this time to kind of attract these consumers. And maybe not ironically, but interestingly, they're addressing women specifically because they know that women are increasingly making these financial decisions on what to buy for the home. So in that sense, women's authority and roles are growing. Not only they're working more, but they're purchasing more, and it's more accepted for them to purchase more. And they're getting more educated and starting to break into fields that previously were not available to them. Let's see. So now to an individual who I do want you to know, because she's a good kind of case study of what's happening in the United States. A couple things that we want to know. So Margaret Sanger was a very prominent activist for women's rights, and specifically for the greater availability of birth control. At this time, right, 1920s, there's a huge social stigma against birth control for a lot of reasons. The idea that birth control would lead to, quote unquote, loose women or promiscuous women, right? And it would, I don't know, it's hard for me to sum that up, but generally, this like very kind of traditional, still very traditional Christian society viewed birth control as something that was dangerous. However, her message of birth control was really popular, especially among the middle class, who, as you can see from this image, right, from this woman who's kind of chained down by unwanted babies. And And no, regardless of your perspective, I need you to understand that um, a lot of you maybe, and maybe some of you do understand, but as a woman at this time period, right? It was no, not only was pregnancy and birth, the birthing process, very dangerous, but it was also something that was seemingly at the time beyond women's control, and tend to, right, in a lot of children, it's a lot of responsibility, and was seen by some women as, something that chained them down. And there were a lot of really sad stories of, women being, right, abandoned by their husband, after bearing them six children, and then they would be left, right, to raise six children by themselves. I mean, this almost certainly, just about every case, led to immediate poverty. And so this is seen by a lot of women who, right, advocated for the right to vote. And some of them thought this is one of the next steps to kind of free women from the constraints of society. They need to be able to have the choice of when, if and when to get pregnant. So we see this kind of this continuation of women's rights. And keep in mind, it's not always a fluid continuation too, because you had a lot of women who were involved in the demand for women's suffrage who do not go along with birth control, because they disagree with it for social and religious reasons. So not everybody was part of this. It was seen as socially destabilizing by a lot of people, and would cause young women to be more loose, more promiscuous. There's actually some sort of truth to that, because we're talking about the flappers, and I laugh, but it's a serious subject, so we need to look and talk about it. But I'm going to talk about the flappers, and you'll see why it's a little bit funny, just a little bit. But yeah, so this is a major concern for women. But we'll talk about how the kind of fears of the promiscuity of women actually does appear in the when we talk about the flappers. Another kind of side point about Margaret Sanger, and I bring it up because I think it's interesting because it also plays into the time period. Margaret Sanger was, by any kind of clear, unbiased account, she was a eugenicist. She primarily was looking to help women with birth control, but she also realized the benefits of state funded birth control to limit populations of physically and mentally handicapped, as well as kind of more undesirable populations like prostitutes, criminals, and then sadly also African Americans. It's fairly well documented, right, that she was looking to curtail population of minorities through birth control, as an attempt to kind of remake society or fashion society in a way that she felt was more beneficial. So you've got these two aspects, right, of this traditional, almost this inherent, what we'll talk about, nativism and kind of like white Protestant dominated society here in Margaret Sanger as well. And so it's an interesting crossover that I need to mention, because it's a sign of the times when we talk about Margaret Sanger. Talking about the flapper movement, this is pretty interesting. Talking about the promiscuity of women at the time. This kind of age-old tradition of Victorian style covering up, and women not being in the workforce and not kind of expressing their emotions out in public, right? Not drinking, not smoking. That's something men do. That age is coming to an end. After World War I, a lot of women entered the workforce. They were making money. They were spending their money. Now, some of them are pushed out of the workforce as their husbands come back or they get married. But as women grow up in the 20s, with this increased consumer spending, young women of middle or upper class families have more money to spend, and then some of the women who had seen a little more authority or had increasing roles during World War I, right? They don't just give that up. So in the 20s, as they have more money, they start to spend on fashionable clothing, right? Increased consumerism, clothing, makeup, other items like that. But it's not just about the material aspects. It's a huge part of that. But it's not just that. These flappers also tended to be more outspoken, increasingly, not all of them, but increasingly sexually promiscuous. I mean, I say not all of them, but generally speaking, when you talk about flappers, that's kind of the point. These are women who didn't want to like hide their bodies, right? They wanted to flaunt themselves physically, and behaviorally as well. They didn't want to be constrained by the traditions of their parents. And so the goal was in a lot of times to go and flirt and be the center of attention. And they did have a bad rap. Now, obviously, with having kind of a bad reputation, it's also alluring to a lot of people. So, right, there are a lot of men and women who participated in this movement, mostly in the urban centers, were kind of was a little more less traditional than your rural areas. But this signals a seeming change in culture. You've got consumerism, you got women's demands to kind of be a part of society in a way that they haven't been or was not acceptable, right? And so you see this growing movement. So flappers get a lot of flack at the time, but they really do help to kind of change the way women are viewed in society. Let me see if I missed anything there. But I think that's all I want to go through there. Let's look to also another kind of big part of social change or social conflict. Let's talk a little bit more about prohibition. Mentioned it last time, right? It's ratified in 1919. It was basically, I mean, this is a century-long or more goal by social advocates, right? Get liquor and alcohol essentially, or curtail it, right? Limit the distribution and consumption of alcohol, which this legislation did. The problem was multifold, however. Right, this progressive movement seems to peak. Yes, they've accomplished it, but it doesn't actually go the way they'd like. The problem was that there wasn't a whole lot of money or effort to enforce prohibition. And so while you basically have what used to be a legal, like an entire industry, a legal industry now made illegal for something that like a huge part of America still wants. What it's going to do, combined with the lack of enforcement, is create a thriving black market for liquor distillation and redistribution. So you get the rise of the mob and the mafia, basically taking over, people like Al Capone, right, taking over the alcohol industry and making a ton of money. Not to mention the violence that ensues as not only our authorities try to crack down, but different mafia groups, right, start to take over territory and fight with each other for alcohol production and distribution. So the violence that ensues is pretty significant and ultimately turns the public perception against prohibition. So basically by 1933, you have another amendment repealing the 18th Amendment. Basically, right, for good or for bad, right, the progressive movement in this case is seen as having failed, right? America tried prohibition. The public generally sees it as having failed because of the violence that is created. And so by 1933, they're going to repeal it. I think that's what we got there. And then let's talk again about nativism. And nativism has seemingly always existed in the United States. It had started to grow after the Civil War. You get the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, and that's continued and made more strict as the years go on. It's eventually made permanent. You get increasing anti-immigration legislation through the progressive era, especially with Woodrow Wilson, and then it continues after World War I. Right, the devastation of the war brings immigrants into the United States, but with that initial economic downturn, and combined with the fear of the Bolshevik Revolution, the spread of communism, and its publicized bombings by anarchists or communists across the United States, the desire to curtail immigration increased dramatically. And so what you get is a renewed nativist movement in the 1920s. For example, in 1921, you've got Congress establishing the quota system. The one we currently use to this day was established in 1921. It's a lot different, right? The quotas aren't exactly the same, but we still have a quota system in the United States for immigration. It's a little more complicated than that, but I don't have time to go into it. So 1921, Congress establishes a quota system. Now, this quota system benefits Northern European countries, or rather, it's prejudiced against everyone else. And so what it did was it set, it basically stipulated that the limit for Italian immigrants has to be the same limit from before 1910. Which, if you know, the Italian immigrants started to come en masse increasingly after 1910. And so it sets this time frame that's really prejudiced against anybody other than Northern Europeans. And that's because a lot of Protestants in Northern Europe, they were seen as more connected and more culturally united with the dominant culture in the United States. So it's primarily, right, how do we ensure a white European Protestant immigration? And so that's kind of what's put forth here. You also get the 1924 National or Nation Origins Acts, 1924 Nation Origins Acts, which banned immigration from East Asia entirely. And not to mention it puts that quota system even further back to, like, I think 1890 or 1900, something like that. So which even basically it's a way to limit not or undesirable elements from the rest of the world coming to the United States. Again, primarily to keep it white, Protestant, and leave the rest out. Last thing I want to mention, I don't have a picture here, was again the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. We have to be careful not to connect necessarily this Ku Klux Klan with the original Ku Klux Klan that originated in 1964 or something, in 1965 or 1864 and 65 at the culmination of the Civil War. That one was essentially rooted out by Ulysses S. Grant, although, right, the sentiment against African Americans and immigrants and whatnot, that doesn't really go away. It's still there in the South. And it reappears here in the 1920s, in part because of the social changes going on. I connect, historians generally connect the Ku Klux Klan and nativism with this emerging traditionalism, right, as an opposition to growing changes. If you remember, right, the Southern economy still is not, even though it is industrializing in some way, it's still mostly rural and mostly agricultural. And they historically have not accepted social change. And so with increasing consumerism, increasing rights of women, they also, what they're going to try to do is prevent the increasing rights and assertions of African Americans, right? As African Americans flee up north to get jobs, these, it's almost seen as challenging Southern white authority. These white supremacists are going to say, no, we don't want African Americans feeling like they can go anywhere. No, we want to keep them essentially in a second class and feeling as if they do not have the same rights we do. And so the goal then is to oppose, right, these growing rights of African Americans and immigrants, but also other religious elements, right? Anything that changes from the normal Protestant, also ironically prohibition, anti-alcohol sentiment. So Catholic immigrants or Catholics in general, right? Not Protestant. Catholic immigrants tend to drink a little bit more, right? They're papists, right? They're not loyal to the United States. So we're going to, right, bully them. And violence was a huge part of this, right? The Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s took a lot of pains to actually make themselves publicly presentable. such as like, bringing their wives and children to Klan rallies and dressed up in white garb and whatnot. But in reality, I mean, so you have that side where they they want to present themselves as someone like a social group that helps society. But you've also got, right, the underlying violence and intimidation of basically anybody who doesn't toe the line. So it's not just Jewish people. It's not just Catholics. It's not just African Americans. Ironically, it's actually also Protestants who drank too much, right? Or Protestants who didn't toe the line. So it really is an effort to maintain traditional culture. And that's what the Ku Klux Klan, in a lot of ways, was attempting to do. And they did it through violence. Now, there was, well, anyway, they'll continue on, but then you'll get a third wave, which we won't talk about because that kind of happens more in the 50s. But in any case, I want to talk about that. So going politically, what's happening? I mentioned Warren G. Harding, right? He runs as kind of Woodrow Wilson becomes more or less incapacitated towards the end of his administration, right? Kind of with his failure to secure the United Nations, the League of Nations, and the 14 points of in a treaty with Europe. He kind of falls apart mentally. He's just getting old, and he kind of ends his administration with other people in charge because he's not able to kind of actually govern. Warren G. Harding, Republican, wins election and is inaugurated in 1921. His big quote or big call is back to normalcy or return to normalcy, right? No more labor protests and strikes, right? So it's the new administration is definitely anti-labor and capitalizing off of this fear of communism, and looking to kind of promote economic profitability, and we'll see that as we go along. One of the big issues with Warren G. Harding is what's called the Ohio Gang. Warren G. Harding was from Ohio, and had a whole bunch of, he brought a whole bunch of his political friends from Ohio, most of whom were corrupt, and we see that play out in his administration. A lot of historians suggest that Warren Harding didn't really know some of the scandals that were going on, but of course you can't really let him off the hook because these were his buddies who were doing it. But generally, his administration was plagued with scandal. Did have a significant boom going on. We do have a slight economic recession in 23, but he essentially is credited with kind of, well, let's talk about some of the scandals here. The Ohio Gang, right? Well, one of his buddies was involved in what's called the Teapot Dome scandal, where this individual, Secretary of the Interior, I believe, Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall, basically, right, as Secretary of the Interior, the United States has control over lands, a lot of which are in the West. So looking at Wyoming on the picture here, there was near the Teapot Dome, I don't know if it was a national monument at the time, but you see that rock a feature there looking like a teapot. You had some wilderness area out there where oil was discovered, and Albert Fall essentially sold this or gave permission to some people he was connected with for an oil company to go in there and drill oil. And in return, he got a kickback for that. So basically what he does is he lends out public land for oil companies to profit off of. So without really paying any taxes, or the government doesn't get much of it, hence the taxpayer doesn't get much of it. But the oil producers do, and Albert Fall does. Eventually, right, this comes to light, is a huge scandal in his administration, among others. We don't really know much about Harding other than he eventually had a heart attack in June 1923 and then died on August 2nd. So that means that President Calvin Coolidge, that we've talked about, former, I believe, governor of Massachusetts, right, putting down that police strike in Boston, eventually, right, becomes president, right, unelected at the time, but then goes on to seek re-election and is duly elected in 1924, and then runs a full term to 1929. So Calvin Coolidge is going to get a little over a full term, probably for, I think it looks like maybe almost 6 years. He notably does not run for re-election. In kind of true to his nature, he was a very small government kind of guy. A lot of, I guess, well, in any case, I'll go on and explain. When Coolidge basically gets in there, he gets rid of a lot of the Ohio gang. He was a little wiser than Harding was, and obviously not being from Ohio and not running with the same crew, he gets rid of the old guys and kind of cleans up the act. He was very aware that the public was concerned about corruption in the administration, in the federal government, and so he gets rid of those guys. One of the most important things he does, his guiding principle, is that government should be involved as little as possible in the economy. So he, in a lot of ways, is the reverse. And in case you're wondering how else we can be anti-progressive era, it's Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge does not want to see the federal government grow. He's not interested in taking a progressive role like Roosevelt had done, Theodore Roosevelt or Wilson had done. He wants to stay out of the way. And so knowing, having this kind of philosophy, he also feels he wants to reduce the federal government's debt and deficit, or rather deficit and thus the debt. And so he hires Andrew Mellon to be Secretary of Treasury. And Andrew Mellon does a pretty good job of balancing. He balances the budget, reduces the debt in what economists call supply side economics. So the kind of derogatory term you might have heard is trickle down economics. Whenever you mention that, just make sure when you mention trickle down economics, you need to put it in quotes, because that is not it's not an economically accurate term. Trickle down economics stems from, or is a criticism of supply side economics. And I might have already kind of tinted or tainted your view of supply side economics, but I have to include trickle down because ultimately people are going to use the phrase trickle down economics to criticize what Reagan does, which isn't always supply side economics. But basically what it means is that the argument is that, lowering taxes is going to allow businesses to more efficiently use the money that they make. And businesses are going to invest that money, lower the prices of their products with new technology that they've invested in, whatnot, in order to grow. And that generally is going to create increased consumer demand because prices are lower and thus stimulate the economy. Within his term, it seemed to produce a significant effect. Now, there are a lot of criticisms, however, because what happens as a result of this, not necessarily directly as a result of this, but we are going to enter into the era of the Great Depression. And so economists are still debating the degree to which supply-side economics actually contributed to this. But at the very least, supply-side economics would not have been the only thing to contribute to the Depression. And I'm not even, at this point, I'm not comfortable saying that the degree to which it did. But I'm pointing out that Calvin Coolidge, right, get the government out of the way, lower taxes, pay off the deficit, and thus pay off the debt. And we did see substantial growth at this time, which we can probably credit in part to Calvin Coolidge's philosophy here. So we can see, right, this is where the debt being reduced from 1921 to 1929. The United States obviously doing a pretty good job there. One more thing before we end this, and then we'll pick up either with African Americans or the Great Depression. I want to talk about the Dows Plan, because this is essentially the United States' plan to help stabilize Europe. Why does the United States want to stabilize Europe? Well, they're not dummies. They realize that there's a lot of demand from Europe that can, right, if there's increasing demand and growing economy in Europe, that means growing U.S. economy. Not to mention, a lot of individuals saw the economic and political turmoil in Europe leading to World War I, and so we want to avoid that. And so the United States was unable to get the Allies after the war, after World War I, to loosen up on Germany. So they levy these huge reparations. But the United States realizes this is not a good way to go. Germany needs to be able to get out, because if Germany can't get out from its debt, it will never recover. And a Europe without a recovering Germany means a Europe without a recovering France and Britain, which means a Europe that is weak and won't buy goods from the United States. So it's in the best interest of the United States, politically, economically, to help Europe. And so what the United States does, especially under Coolidge, is essentially loan money to Germany so that they can pay reparations to Britain and France, who ironically owe money to the United States because we loaned them that money during World War I. So essentially what it is, it's just a giant loan scheme where the United States is in a big circle loaning itself money and trying to get itself paid back for the loans it gave during World War I. It's more complicated than that, but generally the goal is, hey, if Germany can pay its reparations, then Britain and France can pay the United States, so the US gets paid back. Not to mention Germany and Britain and France are growing economically, and thus their economies are contributing to the United States' growing economy. Another part of that, real quickly, was that USA agreed to do this if Britain and France would reduce the amount of reparations that Germany had to pay. So they were able, the United States was able to get concessions from Britain and France and going easier on Germany by the mid-1920s. And so this hopefully, or the hope was that this was going to lead to a renewed Europe. The problem gets pretty complicated as the economy of the United States collapses in the late decade, right, in 1929. It's going to seriously complicate things and ultimately lead to the rise of the National Socialists in Germany, also known as the Nazis, and you know where that goes. But in any case, that's what I wanted to talk to you about here. This has been a pretty long one. I hope this helps you guys out with the 1920s. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'm going to go live pretty soon to help you guys review. All right, see you in a bit.